Welcome to Springboard's 2022 On Demand. Our theme this year is Creative Conversations, connecting teachers with local writers, poets, and storytellers. I am honored to introduce Sarah Venart. Sarah has been published in Canada, the US, and the UK. She is the author of I Am the Big Heart, winner of the 2021 A.M. Klein Award, and listed for the Relit Award. Her first collection, Woodshedding, also received Relit recognition. Sarah lives in Montreal and teaches creative writing and contemporary literature at John Abbott College. I will now pass things over to Sarah for her presentation, Teaching Teenagers About Poetry.
Okay, so I am Sarah Venart, and I'm going to be talking to you today about how to teach poetry to teenagers. I'm also going to be reading a bit of my book that came out this past year, I Am the Big Heart. So I think I'll start with reading some of my own poems, which is something that I would never normally do with my own students. I would never read my stuff to them because there's so much other stuff that I think is really interesting out there. But a little bit about me as a teacher. I'm a contemporary poetry teacher and I teach creative writing at John Abbott College. So I try to keep the text that I read with my students very of the day. I really read with them poetry that's come out in the last 2 or 3 years usually, although I rely on other texts that are older, but for the most part, I keep it very contemporary because I feel like the newer the poetry, the more that the greater the chances that they will be able to relate to it. So in that sense, I could read them my poetry, but I think I'd just be uncomfortable. So I'm going to read 3 poems from I Am the Big Heart. And the first one is called Origami. Origami. At night, I close my eyes and let my thoughts become my feelings. Let my feelings point their corners into darker corners. I fold the word daughter over and over until it contains the word duty. I've heard there's a Kenyan tribe that makes paper by filling their mouths with dust and water. They flatten that paste into stones and fold it into envelopes they send to Japan, where 11-year-old Siberian girls wait in tiny pleated apartments to be models. I pull at the skin and the fat on my hip bones, and the bones beneath become sharp as hangers. Watching a thing become another thing makes me hopeful. Watching string turn into the Eiffel Tower with only 3 fingers and a mouth pulling at its peak is a mystery I should write down. Instead, I'm here on my bed in the dark, watching this girl on YouTube demonstrate Jacob's ladder, witch's broom, cat's cradle. Her hands are so deft. Her transformations effortless. In real time, they twist away and vanish. The second poem that I'm going to read is called The Widening. And I think just before I read this poem, I should say that I think it's really important when you're teaching, and if I had an audience, it would be nice to ask you guys this question, but when you're teaching poetry to students, I think it's important to talk about difficult things with them because they're going through a really difficult time, teenagers, and especially now, but in general, they're going through, tumultuous days every day. So I like to talk to them about like really difficult things like violence and discomfort and hard emotions, because I think that they are drawn to that themselves, just by the nature of their brain chemistry and the hormones that are coursing through their bodies right now. So this is a poem that's kind of about a difficult subject. It's called The Widening. In, I suppose, a pinprick of hope, I look out his windshield, wanting it to be true. Northern lights or meteor showers or something above the valley, so his hand on my thigh has a better explanation. Anything but the trope of furniture maker, rig driver, driving his babysitter home and stopping the car in the ditch. At 2 a.m, the black map of pinpoints above can be joined to form bears and ladles of milk, archers with arrows pointing to north to Hercules. But his hand is on my thigh, same hand that leaves porn magazines for me between the couch cushions, leaves cereal and sour milk, leaves the nails of his children dirty and grasping for their one shared toothbrush. I squint into the distance above the hills. If I want someone to be grateful for me, I don't know it yet. If I want a man's hand on my jeans, I don't know it yet. He decides to point to a series of dots above us. And among the voices in my head, I hear him saying, see, this is a kind of map. And I don't hate him for showing me that because yes, I see it too. It's a mess. Despite the difficult texts that I look at with students, I also like to just show them the simplicity of young, new love, because that's something they're experiencing too. So if I was to read them a poem of mine about something like that, I would probably pick Troy, especially if they were studying myths. Troy. I love Troy, and I carve his name in the blonde oak of the pew and wait for the phone booth for his bus. As it passes by, I find his window silhouette, exquisite throat, delicate Adam's apple. I give away so little of myself when I visit his house. And as long as I wear a t-shirt over swimsuit, place an ice pack on the baby's brother's swollen gums and wash the bacon pan, I can even slide into Troy's pool and do laps. I come up for air and every fiber of a curtain in the upstairs window undulates with Troy. From the filter, I remove leaves so wet they disintegrate on touch. His mother strokes the lace on the velvet elbows of her chair and says, bedroom eyes here wants to sit with you in church. I come home through the back gate in the morning, hoping. On the long bench of atonement, she hands me the baby brother. While Reverend Bagley peers through his bouquet of plastic tulips on the pulpit, Troy looks straight ahead. But I know inside him, there's a horse. The horse will be unbridled if we speak. I run across the backyard. I run past the church. At the diamond, I run up the mountain of trembling bleachers to oversee the red sand paths between first and second base. Far off on the sidelines, the parched observers see my wooden walls. They don't see what's inside me, what it will do for Troy. So I'm just going to read one more poem, and it's called I Believe You Still Have My Key. What's it about? It's about exercising, and which is something I love to do. I love to run. It's about exercising and how when you exert yourself, it's a kind of meditation and things can come out from the past that you didn't even know were still inside you, and you can suddenly be relieved of them. I believe you still have my key. You don't live inside me anymore, I think, as I run past cigarette can, deadwood bench, the man with his too large tongue hanging out. I am not proud of how I treat him, looking past his smoking shroud of need, doing nothing with my thoughts but thinking, could be better, could be sweeter. My excuse? Somewhere around 15, wit closed me safely as a dress seam, or fear, same thing. Inside were sealed all those reminders not to live too much in my ideas, to slip inside your plans instead. A halfway house should be called a waiting house, you once said. I bit myself around the nails to let you out. I was like those fields I've seen recuperating in clover after years of potatoes. At the corner of my street, the man with the tongue hangs out in his waiting house. He's trying to live a little while he waits and tells me to try it too. Live a little. I run past his smolder, run past your smolder, feeling it all, saying little. As for the other words, they sift right through my pockets. They're only grit between my thighs. So those poems can be found in I Am the Big Heart, if you'd like to read them and more. I'm going to talk briefly and share some links now about how I teach poetry to teenagers, how I try to interest them in poetry at the CEGEP level. As you know, if you're a teacher of poetry, a lot of students, I'm not sure where it happens, but they kind of gather this very negative image of what poetry is, and they seem to think that poetry is not for them. And I do everything in my power in my classes to break that down, that idea that poetry is not for them, because it is for them. It is so much for them at this age. And the way that I do that is mostly through an introduction to poetry, starting with Kara Jackson, who was the 2019-2020 National Poet Laureate of the US. She's a Chicago poet. She was a Chicago poet, I should say, because she is still, I'm not even sure if she's writing poetry anymore. She's now become a singer-songwriter. But she may return to poetry, and I hope she does, because she's a fabulous poet. But I start with an essay that she wrote in, I believe it was in 2019, for Poetry Magazine with the Poetry Foundation, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, out of Chicago. And she is a Chicago poet. What I'll do is I'll introduce you to Kara Jackson as through her essay, but I'll send you a link that you can play if you want to learn a little bit more about her as a person. But I'm going to skip that part just for brevity. So I'll start with what I say to students. So the first thing I ask them is, I say, what do you think of when I talk to you about poetry? When I say poetry to you, what's your first initial reaction? And they all have journals in my class, so they start by writing. Most of them, like, I hate poetry. I don't like it at all. I find it's really obtuse. I can't get into it. I find that it's not for me. It's old white men, they'll say, or it's like Shakespeare, or, you know, they'll say that it's not something that relates to them. A few of them will mention, you know, contemporary poetry that they like, but it's very rare. In a class of 40, maybe I'll have one student who will say that she actually reads poetry. So then I talk about poetry can actually be a thing that that's living, that is actually something that they are living through. And it's messy, and it's violent, and it's not calm. And that seems to surprise them, like that it can be something that is, that represents the period of time that they're going through. And then I talk about the teenage years and what they're going through. And I say, you know, your life is not in this classroom. I know that, right? I'll say, like, because they're 18 or 19, I'll say, your life is like at home in your bed, or it's out in the park at night, or that was during COVID. I would talk about that, like meeting friends in the park, because they couldn't go anywhere else. Another thing that I do before I start talking about poetry, I'm sorry, I should have started with this, but we all sit in a circle in my class. We take the desks and put them up against the wall, and we sit in a circle. And why I do that is because even though it takes a lot of time, every single class, at the beginning of class, we do this, this exercise where we're all putting our desks away, mine included, and then we sit in a circle. I think that it makes the classroom a more vulnerable space for me, because I don't have a desk to hide behind, and I don't have a different chair, which I don't know, in the SageUp classroom, they give the teacher a much more comfortable chair, which I don't really agree with. But I'm sitting on a student chair in a circle with them, and all of us we have this open circle in front of us, and we use that space to read poetry or to stand and talk or to read our own stuff. So everyone is equally vulnerable. Everyone is equally powerful. Everyone is equally present. There's no place to hide in the back of the class. And that does make some students very uncomfortable. And then we talk about that. We talk about, why is this uncomfortable? And why is it important that we're all equally, at the beginning of the year, a little bit uncomfortable, but gradually we get comfortable with it. And it's funny, now I'm in week 10, and the students just set up the classroom automatically. We all do it when we walk in, and we're all very comfortable with it now. But at the beginning of the year, there is a period of time where students are uncomfortable, and some of them do sit outside the circle. And I say that's okay. Like, you can gradually come into the circle, but you must attempt it every time. You must attempt to join us every time. And they all do now. They all sit in the circle. So I think the circle and Jackson, both of those vulnerabilities, like showing them who Jackson is, and also having this physical space that is vulnerable, really changes the dynamics of the class. It's not teacher against student. It's all of us together experiencing this thing, and I'm just the leader. So all of that said, now I'll move to to Jackson. So we start by looking at this essay, Teenagers Are Not Exempt from Poetry. I'm not going to read the whole essay, but I'll summarize it. What she does is she makes a comparison to the messiness of being a teenager, and the messiness of poetry, how poetry is about looking thoughtfully at something for an extended period of time, and how that is a kind of messy experimentation and love, right? When we regard something for a long period of time, it is a way of appreciating it or loving it, right? So passion and love is something they can really understand. Students at this age can really understand, because they are feeling these emotions hard, right? So showing them that poetry is also feeling things hard, right? Feeling difficult things is really powerful for them at this age. And it does change their perception of poetry. So we talk about poetry as the byline says here, poetry as, is that called a byline? I think that's not the right term, but anyway, subtext, poetry as deodorant, maxi pad, and thrifted shoe. And I just start by talking about that. So how can poetry be how can that as a tenor have a vehicle in metaphorically as deodorant? Like, how is poetry like deodorant? How is poetry a maxi pad? How is poetry a thrifted shoe? And mostly they fixate on the thrifted shoe these days anyways, because they are big into thrifting right now. So they'll be like, okay, it's rare to find a good shoe, a good thrifted shoe. And so they'll be like, okay, it's like a gift. All right, that makes sense. Maxi pad. Well, if you don't have a maxi pad and you need a maxi pad, getting a maxi pad can be a gift, right? And the right deodorant can be a true gift, which they all understand, right? So we just talk about that. And then we move into, and they've all read this before they come to class. I've given them the link for homework. So being a teenager is a remarkable thing. There's this horrible smoke about us. I like knowing I could shave my head at any moment and not feel shame. It's the way we piss ourselves, make a quilt of our messes. And that stops them right there. They're like, what? Piss ourselves and make a quilt of our messes? What does that mean? And I don't really say much. I just ask them to break it down, like, just be thoughtful about that. What does that mean? When you pee your pants, what is that? And we talk about like, it's just making a mistake, a terrible mistake, a mistake that is mortifying. And then they talk about like the mistakes that they make that are mortifying, which are so to us as adults, like inexplicably small and minor things that are huge experiences for them. Like imagine peeing yourself in class, right? That's just mortifying to them. But the fact that when they make this mess, when they make these mistakes, whatever their mistake is, they can make a quilt out of it. They can make something from it. And then we talk about that for a long time, and how poetry is a way of taking any mistake that you make and making art out of it. So those are the things we talk about, but we read the entire essay. Not only do we read the entire essay, Jackson has been wonderful enough to include a ton of references to different poets in here. So we look at Patricia Smith's should have been Jimmy Savannah. And we read a couple of Gwendolyn Brooks poems. And we read Fatima Asghar, My Love of Nature. What else do we look at? We look at Sharon Olds. We look at Anne Sexton. Very briefly, Tara Betts. Eve L. Ewing. I can't recommend her enough for students. She's a terrific poet to look at with students. Because they get it, they get her. So we look at some of these poems, and it's a very short essay, which is also good because students, their attention span is not huge these days in COVID. But we look at all these texts with Kara Jackson. So we spend a good 4 hours of class time over a couple of weeks, going back and forth between the poems and this essay. And then we look at a Kara Jackson poem. And this is the poem that I always begin with. It's called Love Poem with a Knife. And we talk about the form of it. So I'm going to actually read this poem because I think if I read it, you'll really understand why students get into it. So Love Poem with a Knife. In talking about loving you, I consider murder. Consider your pistol of a mouth, jaw long and smoking. When I ask you how to be pretty for you, you suggest murder, defend it, call a dead woman the least vain. In talking about loving men, my mother suggests loving a knife. First, learn if sharpness can be a good father, if a blade can make kissy faces. Every woman wants a man, few want a good knife. I name my kitchen a love war. Look for you in the cutting drawer. Look for you in my razor. Make a romance out of nicking. I have no secrets for first dates. Just keep chopping. Put his edge to your neck. He will let you bleed first. No, after you. And this is why I leave and come back. I know I'm a woman by the way I take war, by the way I let weapons give me children, even sliced and undone, by the way our love is pressing the wound. I just love that poem. So we talk about the danger in this poem, the violence in this poem, and I get them to write what it brings up in them in their journal. What do you think of this poem? How is this not a poem? How is this a poem? How does this surprise you as a poem? So we use Jackson's essay, Jackson's poem herself, the Eve L. Ewing. I really use a lot of her work because she's contemporary. And we talk about it for, a good 4 hours of class time, slowly. And then the next thing that we do is we do a writing exercise, which I'm trying to get to. It's under here. How do I get to it? Is there a way to move it? Oh yeah, I can move it. Okay, so here we go. So it's called a quiz because we began this semester online. So I actually did this as a quiz, but normally I would do it as an in-class exercise. So from the questions below, pick one and write less than and no more than 250 words of analytical response. This is harder to do than you might initially suppose. To write such a short response, you must be concise. I expect proper grammar, sentence structure, and concise word choice that communicates clearly and simply. And then I talk about that. And then I say, have fun. So 250 words, MLA format, and I suggest how they can find that information, and then the due date, because it was on Teams. So they have choices of what they can do. And I talk about recklessness, violence, danger, and poetry, right? And I specifically quote certain things in the text. So I'll be sending that along to you afterwards, but I just wanted to show you one student's response to that. So this is a student, Eva, who is in my class, and she responded with her text, which is in beautiful MLA format, right? Her title is, "Do you have a poem? I'm on my period." So in Teenagers Are Not Exempt from Poetry, Kara Jackson uses symbolic language to describe poetry itself, as well as her fascination for it. She uses metaphors such as poetry still looking for the right deodorant, or comparing it to a maxi pad or a thrifted shoe. So the student is really focusing on the I don't really like to call it a lecture, the discussion that we had in class. These comparisons are chosen specifically so her teenage audience can relate and understand what message she is trying to convey. First, by saying that poetry is still looking for the right deodorant, she is indirectly comparing poetry to teenagers themselves. While growing up, every young adult is confronted with the issue of finding the right deodorant. In that way, she says that poetry is in the coming of age process and still being shaped and is changing over time, just as young adults. So I won't finish reading that, but you can screen grab it and look at it if you want. But that's just one possible response. Other students chose to look at certain texts that Kara Jackson looked at. So I'm just going to show you one example of that. And there it is. So this is my student Shreya. And she looks at specifically at Sharon Olds' His Stillness. She chose that one. Out of all the Sharon Olds poems that she could have looked at on Poetry Foundation. And then she writes an analysis of that poem. And it's a beautiful analysis. She did a really great job. So there's various options that they have, and they can enter poetry through several means. So Eva's means was through just kind of thinking about the lecture that I keep calling it a lecture, the discussion that we had in class, but you could do various other things. Like look at specific texts. So that is how I enter into poetry with students. From there, we move to a recitation of a contemporary poet. So they recite using the Poetry Out Loud model, which is the American recitation contest. I have them recite a poem on video or in person, depending on if it's COVID or not. And then they write an essay on the poem that they recited. So they know the poem really well because they've recited it. They've memorized it and recited it. So they know it very well, and they tend to get into those essays, surprisingly. And then at the end of the semester, we take that essay, revise it, and actually stitch it into a book rather than handing the essay in on paper, which they do for the first draft. They hand it in a chapbook form. So they actually stitch this little book that has the essay along with other assignments, and they make it into a book that they hand in. And I don't know I still haven't figured it out exactly what changes about having the essay and the other creative text in book form, but I get such great material from them because they know that it's going to be in this book. I'm just going to stop sharing. They know that it's going to be in this book when they hand it in to me, and that other students will be looking at their books, because we have like a vernissage and a show and tell. Everybody looks at each other's books, and somehow that makes them more aware of audience and more aware of someone reading their work. And the quality is higher than, I've been teaching for 20 years, I guess. The quality is higher than I used to get when I would just get them to hand in an essay on 8.5 by 11 white paper. It tends to make them a little bit more engaged in poetry. So that's what works for me. And if we had an audience now, I would ask for your questions, but please feel free to send me your questions. I would be thrilled to answer them. So I'm sure you can get my email address from the conference, or you could also just Google me. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, etc. That's Sarah Venart, as Sarah Venart. So I would be happy to hear from you, and I'd love to hear how, if you take some of my suggestions, how they work in your classroom. And that's it. That's all I have for today. So thank you very much for listening all the way through, and have a great day. Thank you.